The wall is defended against enemies. Nehemiah deals with oppression within and opposition from without as a generous governor. Much to the chagrin of his enemies, the wall is finished, and the Apostle Paul speaks of spiritual gifts. Today on 3 in 1, as we consider Nehemiah chapters 4 through 6 and 1 Corinthians chapter 12. The people had a mind to work, and they arose together to build. And this was driving the enemy crazy. So the enemy sent in Sanballat and Tobiah once again. We read this in our reading today. But so it happened. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." Man, can you see why mockery is such an effective trap? Now, do you remember from our last episode, what is the only godly recourse to such an attack? Well, it's prayer. We read this today in verse 4. "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads, and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. I love that. I love how after a time of prayer, there was a time to work. A prayer of faith was followed by a walk of obedience. So we follow suit in kneeling in prayer and then standing in faith, getting busy about our Father's business. But once again, whenever the people of God say, "Let us arise and build," the enemies of God say, "Let us arise and attack." So once again, the people respond to the attack with prayer. In verse 7 we read, "And now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry, and all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them we set a watch against them day and night." Now, I love this. There's prayer and there's practicality. Yes, prayer is practical, but they did something beyond prayer. They responded with wisdom. They put someone on the wall to watch. Did you hear that in verse 9? It said, "Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night." That's wisdom. Now, not all of the attacks are from without. Sometimes the greatest discouragement can come from within. In verse 10 of chapter 4, we read this. "Then Judah said, 'The strength of the laborers is failing, and there's so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall.' And our adversary said, 'They will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease.' So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came, they told us 10 times, 'From whatever place you turn, they will be upon us.'" Now, did you notice it said, how many times did they say this? 10 times. I mean, that's a lot of times of saying that, and that could be so discouraging. I mean, imagine them saying that 10 times. "From whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. From whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. From whatever place you turn, they will be..." That's only 3 times, and that's getting annoying. Can you imagine 10 times? Discouragement was spreading like an airborne illness, and Nehemiah needed to act quickly. So we read in verse 13, "Therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses.'" Ha! Can you see now why we need the entire body of Christ? Now, in this situation, Ezra would have sat down and just started crying, but not Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a little different breed. He rounds everybody up as discouraged as they were, and he shouts encouraging truth into their weary souls, saying to them, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, for your sons, for your daughters, for your wives, and for your houses. Now, what does the Bible say about resisting the devil's discouragement? In James 4:7 it says, "Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And that's what we saw in the book of Nehemiah today, reading this in verse 15. And it happened when our enemies heard it, that it was known to us, and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked on construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried the burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked on construction, and with the other hand they held a weapon. I love that. Building and battling in the midst of the enemy, resisting the enemy, and they have to flee. This is the life of a believer. It's the next to them life. Remember that from the earlier chapter? Next to them, and then next to them, and then next to them, strengthening. Never stop building, never stop battling. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, for your sons, for your daughters, for your wives, and for your homes. Now, up to this point, the enemy has been attacking all of the people in a general sense. And in chapter 6, the enemy focuses their attack on Nehemiah specifically. We read this in verse 1 of chapter 6. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem said to me, "Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono." But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them saying, "I am doing a great work, so I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you?" But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered in the same manner each time. See, Nehemiah has enough discernment to know that they intend to do him harm. And so he responds accordingly with a simple, straightforward message. I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? See, he knew that all they were trying to do was to intimidate him into stopping the work. And that's exactly what the enemy still wants to do today. He's relentless by any means necessary. Take the leader down. Take Nehemiah down. So we read this in verse 5. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time with an open letter in his hand. It was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall, that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, and let us consult together." And then I sent to him, saying, "No such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart." For they were all trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. I love that. Man, any less of a man would have just freaked out or fought in the flesh, but not Nehemiah. He took this open letter with all of their accusations, and he brought it to the Lord and said, Lord, you knew this, you know this, now strengthen my hands. It's so awesome. Persevering in prayer, building and battling. And you know what? Verse 15 told us the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it and all the nations around saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. Man, that's awesome. All of that, even though it may have felt like an eternity for Nehemiah, was actually only 52 days. Now, can I tell you, one of the reasons why Ezra and Nehemiah are such incredibly important books to me is because we were going through an incredibly difficult season during the time that I was teaching the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It was like we were living the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I had friends around me, faithful friends that were shouting truth into my soul. And one of those faithful friends told me at one point, I know that you feel like you'll never get through this. And you feel like this is never going to end. But if you just add 6 months to this, everything's going to be different. So just stay faithful, Dom. Continue to do that which God has called you to do. And you know what? I'll confess, about 98% of me didn't believe him, and only about 2% did. But I clung to that 2%, that truth that God is faithful in the lives of his people, and he's looking all over the world to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. And if you just continue to do what God calls you to do, he will strengthen you to do that as you never stop building. You never stop battling. You continue to do what God has called you to do. And you know what? It was a little bit more than 52 days, but eventually everything did change. And we entered into a new season. And we just saw how awesome the Spirit of God works through the Word of God to strengthen and establish his people. Okay, now on to our New Testament reading, 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, I've told you a few times now that Ezra and Nehemiah are some of my absolute favorite books in the Bible. So again, please forgive me if we give a little less time to our New Testament readings while we're going through those books. But maybe this gives us an opportunity. Sometimes a simple, succinct word can do so much more than a rambling bunch of words. So what is the simple, succinct word for 1 Corinthians 12? Well, here's my best attempt. God has given us all spiritual gifts, giving them to us so that he can give to others through us. See, these gifts given to us are so that God can give through us. So these gifts were never really for us. We are just the conduit for God's love and grace and mercy. I heard a friend pray a prayer one time saying, God, I want to be an ever-increasing conduit of your love. And that's what all of the spiritual gifts are for, if we're faithful to develop those gifts. When we are faithful to develop those gifts through diligent use, these gifts will become an ever-increasing conduit of God's love and grace and mercy and provision. And we've all been given at least one of these gifts listed here, as we are all members of one body, all members of his body. And so here's our application. Knowing that God has given these gifts to us so that he can give to others through us. Ask God what gift he has given to you. And then ask him for the faith to continually give that gift away as you become an ever-increasing conduit of his mercy, his grace, his hope, and his love.